So good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's program, Why Jewish Women's History Matters Today, co-presented with the Jewish Women's Archive. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you all again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able, you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn those on and off are posted in the chat. In the chat, there are also several helpful links about both the Museum of Jewish Heritage and the Jewish Women's Archive, so we hope you'll take some time to check those out. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by Judith Rosenbaum. Judith is CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive. Thank you for joining us, a pioneering digital archive that documents Jewish women's stories, elevates their voices, and inspires them to be agents of change. Judith earned a PhD in American Studies from Brown University with a focus on women, gender, and social movements. An educator, historian, and writer, she teaches, lectures, and publishes widely on Jewish studies and women's studies. And again, you can learn more about the Jewish Women's Archive and their work at the links in the chat. Thank you all for joining us. And now I'll hand things over to Judith. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. I am really delighted to be here this evening. Happy Women's History Month, everybody. It's just a pleasure to be able to be gathered together and to share some stories that I hope will immerse us in some of the reasons why Jewish women's history matters and kind of bolster us for the times that we're living in right now. I've been the CEO of JWA for about 10 years, but have been involved for many more years than that. I do this work because I'm passionate about history and Jewish community and women's stories. And I believe that history really matters. And I feel that particularly urgently these days. I'm very excited to have this opportunity to share with you some of the work of JWA today. So I want to start by just sharing a tiny bit about what JWA is and does. I hope that you will take the time to explore a little bit more on your own, and then we'll delve into the stories. But JWA is a digital archive. We were founded in the early days of the internet and have been growing and adapting along with it. Our mission, as you heard, is about documenting Jewish women's stories and elevating their voices. And we do that really to help people understand that everyone makes history. We're really working on transforming how we think about history and who makes history. Unlike a traditional archive, we emphasize access. This is your story. It belongs to you. It shouldn't be locked up only for people who have particular credentials. And we make everything available and freely available on our site. We also really approach history as a tool for social change. I always say that, history is basically the study of change over time. So if you are interested in how change happens and you're interested in trying to make change, you really need to understand history. You need to know what came before so that we can build on it and learn from it and make progress. History is in that way very relevant. It shapes our understanding of ourselves, of the world, and what we're able to imagine for the future. It also provides a lot of context and lessons and instruction for the pressing issues of our time. And that is really what we try to focus on at JWA. We do that through really a lot of different kinds of resources. We have exhibits and an encyclopedia and curricular materials and a podcast and a book club and many virtual programs and fellowships for teens and for our newest fellowship is for Jewish women of color. And we're very excited about all of the the materials that we make available. About 15 million people around the world use our content and our everything we put out on in our archive and on social media each year. We're always expanding and diversifying the narrative. At least 30% of the new content that we produce each year focuses on underrepresented stories. So we're very proud that we're continually expanding the Jewish narrative in that way. I want to say a little bit also about what history is, which I think gets at this question of why it matters to look at women's history. And I like to quote Rosa Sonnenschein in doing that. She wrote, not what has happened, but what is recorded makes history. Sonnenschein was a writer. She was a society woman and lay leader in St. Louis. She was also the editor of the American Jewess, which was the first English language publication for American Jewish women, which she published from 1895 to 1899. A short run, but chock full of all kinds of really interesting pieces. It addressed an incredibly wide range of issues, from whether it was okay for women to ride bicycles to early ideas about Zionism. JWA has, I am proud to say, digitized and made available online the full run of the American Jewess, so you can browse through it and look at some of those pieces. But in her first issue, in the first editor's letter, she wrote, "Not what has happened, but what is recorded makes history." What did she mean by this? Obviously, people are making history every day just by living our lives. But what she is reminding us is that what becomes the history that is known and that goes on to shape who we are is the history that is recorded. And that is why it was important for her to publish the American Jewess, because she felt that there were all kinds of really rich, exciting conversations that were happening for American Jewish women at that time. And she wanted those to be, documented and on record. But it's also why JWA does the work that we do to document Jewish women's stories and to make sure that people of all genders grow up with the knowledge of their full heritage, which includes the contributions and experiences of all people. Why is this particularly important in a Jewish context? The Jewish community places a great deal of emphasis on history, but despite that, we tend to only focus on a very narrow slice. And it's not a slice that usually includes the experiences of Jewish women, except perhaps in their family roles. Letty Cotton Pogrebin, a pioneering Jewish feminist, put this very clearly. She wrote, "For people whose ethos, whose very identity is founded in remembering, we have forgotten too much about Jewish women. For a community that calls itself the people of the book, we have left too many pages blank." So JWA exists in part to fill those pages. And one of the things I hear most often when I teach is, why didn't I learn this before? And we were founded really to make sure that there would be no excuse to leave out women, to document it for the future and make it accessible for all. But what I want to emphasize, and which I hope what I will talk about today will make clear, is that including women's stories is not just an additive process. So, Letty Cotton Pogrebin was right that we're filling those pages, but when you do that, it doesn't just make the book longer. It actually changes the story of the book. It helps us understand it differently. When we incorporate Jewish women's perspectives and experiences, we often find that the traditional narrative shifts in really meaningful ways. And so that's what I want to try to illustrate for you today. So I'm beginning actually with somebody who is, in fact, quite well known generally in Jewish history, and that is Henrietta Zold. She's most famous, of course, as the founder of Hadassah, but she has a much bigger story than that. And really, it's only that piece of her as founder of Hadassah that is known. Zold was born in Baltimore in 1860. She was the oldest daughter of a rabbi who only had daughters, so he educated her as he would have a son. And that's actually, we'll see that come up again. There's a very powerful story throughout history of the daughters of fathers who had no sons and what was possible for them that may not have been possible had their family circumstances been different. Zold became an educator with the Russian refugee population, which was very present at that time in the late 1800s. She was also a writer who published essays on many different Jewish issues of the day. And in fact, she published her first essay on Zionism in 1896, a month before Herzl published his first Zionist writings. So we think of Theodor Herzl as being, the father of modern Zionism. But in fact, there were women like Henrietta Zold who were already writing about these ideas at the same time or beforehand. Zold became the head of the Jewish Publication Society. In that role as an editor and a translator, she influenced Jewish scholarship. She also was a special student at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. They allowed her to be a student under the condition that she not try to seek rabbinic ordination. They said she couldn't study there if she was hoping that she was going to get to that point. But she was a very active member of the intellectual community there. She helped many of the scholars there with their writing and editing and translation and made an impact in that way. However, the limitations that she was finding within the work that she was doing and the kind of boundaries on what she was allowed to do and what kind of roles she could take on were very frustrating to her. She was brilliant, she was well educated, and there were very clear limitations to what she could take on. And I think that that was really crucial in what pushed her to turn her attention to Palestine. She traveled to Palestine for the first time in 1909 at age 49. She was shocked by the poverty and disease there and returned to the US really determined to organize Jewish women to help. And that led to the founding of Hadassah. And through Hadassah, she built the medical, educational, and social services infrastructure of the state of Israel. She made Aliyah to Palestine in 1920 at age 59. Of course, she also faced sexism there. That's not to say that she left behind all of those challenges, but in one of the opportunities that comes about in building something new is that there is just a little bit more openness, a little bit more opportunity for women to take on different kinds of roles. There is a lot more to say about the work that she did there. She was a founder of Youth Aliyah, saved thousands of children from the Shoah. She also supported a binational state. That is, she was among some of the Zionist leaders who felt that there was, as they were thinking about what a state of Israel would look like, that there was an opportunity to build a state that would be a Jewish and Arab state. That is not really talked about much in talking about her legacy now, but is kind of an interesting piece of her story. And I think that when we know her story more fully, we can understand more about the social context of the time, how she came to influence Zionism and the state of Israel, and the kind of wider range of perspectives that were part of the vision of Zionism at that time, which I think is particularly important in this moment where there are very, sort of rigid conceptions of what, and somewhat flattened conceptions of what Zionism is. I want to turn to some other activists who are not well known, but who I think challenge us to think differently about who activists are, what activism looks like, not only through building institutions like Zoll did, not only on places like the shop floor as labor activists did in the same period that Henrietta Zold was working, but also in the home and the marketplace. And to do that, I want to talk about the 1902 kosher meat boycott. When we think about immigrant activism, we usually think about the labor movement, right? We think about the ways that immigrant women were played important roles in the labor movement in the early 20th century and had an impact on changing the way that the labor movement functioned and who the labor movement understood as workers and what could be fought for. But immigrant Jewish women also helped broaden the kind of social justice field or social movement field to include housewives, including women in their roles as consumers and as domestic managers, and really harnessing the power of informal neighborhood networks. So what happens in 1902? The price of kosher meat, this is in the spring, in May, the price of kosher meat rises sharply. Jewish immigrant housewives in New York City launch a kosher meat boycott that lasts about a month. It spreads to several other boroughs in New York. It attracts a great amount of attention from both the Jewish and the general press. Now, women had historically been involved in popular protests around issues like food prices, but this moment in 1902 really stands out as a pioneering example of women's strategic political organizing and use of local networks. Kosher meat prices had been rising for about a year. They had gone up in the spring from about 12 to 18 cents per pound wholesale. And the small butchers responded by boycotting the wholesalers. The wholesalers were known as the meat trusts, and those were primarily well-to-do German Jews. That was an attempt to lower prices. But then they settled with the meat trust without achieving a price reduction by mid-May, meaning that they agreed to raise the price of the meat that they sold so that they could pay the higher price that wholesalers were asking and passing the burden of paying more for meat to the individuals and families who bought their products. At this point, the housewives of the Lower East Side had had enough, and they decide to take matters into their own hands. They begin to canvass their neighborhoods to drum up support. They bring thousands of women into the streets on May 15th to protest and declare a boycott. And these protesters then break into butcher shops. They confiscate meat from customers. We're talking like hand-to-hand combat in some cases here. And they engage in violent clashes with the police. Approximately 70 women and 15 men are arrested. And I'm showing here on this slide a political cartoon that shows the gate that says Kosher Meat Trust, and the woman is standing there with her key, and it says the power of women, right? So it's talking about how women are going to be able to face the meat trust in a different way than anyone had before. I want to share with you just a brief piece of a report from one of the Yiddish papers, the Yiddish Tagblatt, which was an Orthodox paper, and they are reporting on this battle that happened on May 15th. We will not give away our last few cents to the butchers. We want to eat meat at 12 cents and not 16 cents a pound. This is the cry taken up yesterday by women from Houston to Cherry Streets, from Christie to Norwich Streets, the voices of housewives who are ready to fight. Mrs. Adelson became chairlady of the assembly. New York has never seen such a huge convocation of women before. The women this time let the men play at home with the children while they went to attend the meeting. They cried, "Our husbands work hard. They try their best to bring a few cents into the house, and we must manage to spend as little as possible." Others responded, "We will not be silent. We will overturn the world." Oop. So following this riot, the Committee of Women Leading the Boycott hold a mass meeting to gather support and to strategize. The next day, they go from house to house. They organize their fellow housewives. They collect funds to pay arrest fines and reimburse customers whose meat had been grabbed in the riot. And they set up pickets in front of the butcher shops. Rioting continues. More than 100 people are arrested. The boycott spreads to the Bronx and to Harlem. On Saturday, May 17th, is Shabbat. The boycott leaders do not take this as a day of rest from their cause, but they go from synagogue to plead their cause. And some of them even use the traditional communal tactic of interrupting the Torah reading to bring their issue to the community. They ask men, this is what their request is at the synagogue, they ask men to encourage their wives to uphold the boycott, and they request rabbis to endorse the boycott. By the following day, this was pretty effective. Most of the kosher butcher shops had agreed to the boycott and closed. It had also spread to Brooklyn. That night, more than 500 women meet to organize and strategize further. Now they're using the name the Ladies Anti-Beef Trust Association. They establish committees across New York City, and they begin to organize house-to-house patrols and surveillance of butcher shops. They assign committees to visit labor union meetings and to plan cooperative kosher meat stores where people could buy families could purchase meat in large quantity and at a wholesale price. And they send a delegation to the mayor's office to ask for permission for a rally. At this point, male leaders in the community start to get a little nervous and they decide it's time to get involved. So on May 21st, they hold a conference of 300 people representing synagogues and other organizations, and they form the Allied Conference for Cheap Kosher Meat. And they tell women it's time to leave the fighting to the men, but women are not ready to give up the fight yet. They're in it to win it. The boycott continues to attract supporters. More and more organizations and leaders are joining in. Overall, the boycott met really widespread support throughout the community. Rabbis spoke about the boycott from their pulpits. Crowds came to the courthouse to support the women who'd been arrested. The Jewish newspapers cover the boycott sympathetically. Labor unions support them as well. The strike officially ends on June 5th. Retail meat prices return to 14 cents per pound. The kosher meat cooperatives that had been established during the boycott continue to operate. The boycott had been a success, but it's not a permanent one. The meat prices eventually begin to rise again. However, what I think is really innovative here and worth pointing out is that unlike other Jewish immigrant activists of the period, the leaders of this boycott are not young workers. They are housewives with children. The average age of the boycotters was 39, and most had 4 or more children at home. It's also important to understand that these are not, though they, the papers like to write about the riots in this kind of, playing up the violence and the anger. These aren't spontaneous riots. These are political acts. These were political actors who are making strategic planned calculations, drawing very creatively on their neighborhood networks and pioneering many of the tactics of community organizing that are still used today. They also use explicitly political language in their fight. They refer to themselves as strikers. They call people who broke the boycott scabs. They refer to freedom of speech when they're protesting police disruptions of the gathering. And they really were able to sustain their activism over several weeks. And they model an approach that is used again in rent strikes and other boycotts moving forward. What I like to think about, as I said at the beginning, when we think about immigrant women's activism, we often think about the labor movement and we think about garment workers and such. And of course, the biggest garment workers strike was in 1909 and 1910, the uprising of the 20,000. So that is just 7.5 years later that happens. And what I always think about is the girls, the young women of the uprising of the 20,000, who at the time of the kosher meat boycott were young girls who maybe were, watching from behind their mother's skirts, going with them to the boycott, to the butcher shops. And so I see this in many ways as a kind of prelude to the explosion of women's activism in the big garment industry strikes at the end of the decade. I want to turn to a different kind of activism that I think also helps us think about women's role in a different way. And that is looking at resistance in the Holocaust, which we come to understand very differently when we incorporate women's contributions. Often when people talk about resistance during the Holocaust, we often think of things like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We think about armed struggle. But I think it's very important to understand resistance more broadly. And the more that scholars uncover women's experiences and explore what women's forms of response to the Holocaust were, they come to understand resistance in a broader way to include the kinds of daily acts of survival and the daily acts of bravery that made possible other kinds of more overt resistance. So I want to talk a little bit about the couriers or the kashariot. These were young women, mostly in their teens and early 20s, who were smugglers, who were couriers, who carried things back and forth within the ghetto, outside of the ghetto, into the ghetto. They smuggled secret documents, underground newspapers, money, medical supplies, intelligence, forged papers, weapons and ammunition, and eventually other Jews in and out of the ghetto. This was extremely, extremely difficult and dangerous work. There was a death penalty for Jews found outside of the ghetto. But women were able to do this actually much more effectively than men were. They could pass much more easily, most obviously because they were not circumcised. So if they were caught, it was harder to prove immediately that they were Jews. Women also were more likely to be able to pass because they were more likely to have better Polish language skills. Frequently, Jewish families used their funds to send their boys to Jewish education, to Jewish schools, and they sent their girls to Polish schools, which were cheaper or in some cases free. So girls had more native Polish skills, and they also had grown up working more closely with other Poles and therefore were more kind of culturally competent. Women were also expected to be out in the street during the day. They weren't expected to be at work, so they could be walking the street and not, that wouldn't be obviously strange. And women often have better soft skills of picking up on social cues, alertness to threats around them, ability to respond in non-threatening ways. And finally, women were often underestimated. So people assumed that they were less likely to do this dangerous work and didn't kind of bring that assumption when they saw women out in the street. But they did have to think on their feet and take many risks. And this is just these photos of some of the Kashario give you a sense of how young and just sort of beautiful and innocent some of these women looked. I want to tell you a little bit, an example from Branka Klebanski, who is the woman in the center of this slide. She was a courier in Bialystok. She was smuggling a there was one time where she was smuggling a revolver and 2 hand grenades that were hidden in a loaf of bread in her suitcase. She's stopped at a train station by a German policeman who asks her what's in her bag. So she really thinks very quickly. She doesn't want her bags to be open because they will find all kinds of things that are in there. So she confesses that she's smuggling food, which is also illegal, but obviously less illegal than smuggling arms. And by doing that, she manages to avoid having to open her suitcase. That he's willing to kind of let pass. She sort of does it in a flirtatious way. Um, there are stories of some of these couriers being so bold as to ask a soldier to carry a bag that's heavy and say, "Oh, this bag is too heavy for me. Could you help me with it?" And the soldier, wanting to be gallant, carries the bag and in fact brings a bag with ammunition onto the train or across the gate or whatever they're trying to do. Um, the mortality rate for these acts was incredibly high. They did not expect to survive. The That means that the turnover rate was high, and most of the women who were engaging in these acts were not experienced. They didn't get to do it very often. But they were seen at the time as absolutely essential to the story of resistance. And for some reason, they really have not until recently been remembered as such. What are some of the reasons why those stories would have been lost? Most of them did not engage in armed combat. So when people were writing the history of resistance and thinking about armed resistance, their stories were not included. Most of these women did not survive. Therefore, it is harder to know their stories. For the ones who did survive, many felt guilty about that, and they wanted to tell the stories of the people who had not survived and not their own stories. Many of these women also were not in concentration camps. They were surviving sometimes in the ghettos until late, sometimes with the partisans. Um, so because of the dynamics of kind of Holocaust memory, there was a sense that people who hadn't been in the camps weren't sort of real survivors. And often they felt like their story was not the real story that was supposed to be told. But the armed resistance that did happen couldn't have happened without the work of the couriers to collect weapons and ammunitions, and perhaps even more importantly, to spread the word of the Germans' plans and the need to resist. They were the first ones to kind of get the word out of what was happening at the camps and to help people understand what the intentions of the Germans were. And in doing so, they were sowing the seeds of like, we have to resist this. We can't go on and just expect that we're going to live through this and then return to our lives. So that became a very key piece of, continuing to live to try to fight back in ways large and small, despite the odds, became a key piece of the story of resistance. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about rabbinic leadership as an area of women's contribution as well. Now, obviously, the inclusion of women in the rabbinate is a very significant development in both Jewish history and women's history, and JWA is proud to have a collection of many women rabbis' stories. But we also have stories that kind of complicate and deepen the story of women as rabbinic leaders beyond the usual narrative of the firsts. And here we have some of the firsts shown on the slide. Sally Priesand on the left, the first American woman ordained as a rabbi, Rabbi Angela Warnick-Buchdahl, the first Asian American rabbi, and Sarah Hurwitz, who is the first Orthodox woman ordained as a rabbi, or rabbah is the term that she uses. But I want to step way back before those figures and talk about another pioneering woman rabbi whose story JWA has helped tell and put into the conversation of women's religious leadership. It's a lost story. It's a story of Regina Jonas, who was really, we think, the first modern ordained woman rabbi in 1935 in Berlin. But her story was very nearly lost. She was born in 1902 into a poor Orthodox Jewish family in Berlin. She was one of these rare people who are able to imagine something that they have never seen exist. At JWA, we often say, if you can see it, you can be it, meaning representation is very important. And when we see role models of things, we can imagine ourselves into those roles. But there are always some rare and exceptional people who can imagine themselves into places that they have never seen someone like themselves. And Regina Jonas was one of those. By age 11, she felt called to be a rabbi, and that was her dream. So she pursued it throughout her life. She studied. By the 1920s, she was studying at the Academy for the Science of Judaism, taking all the same courses and exams required of rabbinical students, but it was not clear that she was going to be ordained. She wrote her dissertation on the topic, Can Women Serve as Rabbis? And this paper, which she submitted in 1930, is the first known attempt to find a halachic basis, that is a basis in Jewish law for the ordination of women. She did have a faculty member who seemed ready to ordain her, but he died suddenly. And so therefore, when she graduated from the Academy for the Science of Judaism, they decided to only grant her the degree of academic teacher of religion. She was obviously disappointed, but she was not daunted. She went on to teach religion at several girls' schools in Berlin. Finally, in 1935, she found a rabbi who was willing to ordain her, Rabbi Max Dienemann, and he represented the Association of Liberal, that is, Reform Rabbis in Berlin. Even despite this ordination, she still had limited job opportunities. She was basically invited to continue to teach in schools and to work in Jewish hospitals and nursing homes. However, as the Nazi vice was tightening, and many rabbis either fled or were deported, there was an increasing unmet need for rabbinic leadership. And so in that difficult moment, Rabbi Jonas was able to serve in synagogues for the first time that were desperate for rabbinic leadership and now were willing to, accept such leadership from a woman. Many people counseled her to leave as well. She did not want to leave her elderly mother. And so she and her mother were deported in November of 1942 to Terezin. Before being deported, she very wisely gave her documents, just a couple of boxes of her papers, to the Berlin Jewish community for safekeeping, and those survived the war. In Terezin, she functioned as a rabbi for 2 years. She taught, she gave, served in a pastoral care role. She gave sermons. And actually in the archives of Terezin, there's a handwritten document that she kept. It's a list of the topics of the lectures that she gave there under the heading, Lectures by the Only Female Rabbi, Regina Jonas. She and her mother were deported to Auschwitz on October 12, 1944, and they were murdered there, probably pretty much right upon arrival. And then she was seemingly forgotten. Now, this is a little bit puzzling because there were people who she had worked with who survived. In fact, some very famous leaders, people like Leo Beck, people like Viktor Frankl, whom she knew well and had worked with. And these people survived, but they did not tell her story. So in some ways, her story was written out of history twice, once by the Nazis who robbed her of her life, and again, in some ways, by the post-war Jewish community that did not have a place for her story. It didn't fit into the narrative that was being told. It didn't fit. And so her story was kind of left behind. Thankfully, her papers, which were behind the Berlin Wall, were discovered by scholars in 1991 when some of those archives began to open. And scholars began to write about her and rediscover her, and then people who knew her came out of the woodwork and started to talk about her. However, no one ever said Kaddish for her. Until 2014, when a group of rabbis and scholars who were organized by the Jewish Women's Archive and the American Jewish Archive went together on a trip to Berlin and Prague in Regina Jonas's footsteps. And that the picture that's on the right side of the screen is of Sally Priesand, Sally Eisenberg Sasso, and Amy Eilberg, the first rabbis in the Reform, Reconstructionist, and Conservative movement in America on that trip. And one of the things that came out of that trip was the decision to create an official date. We don't know the actual date of her death, but we know it was in October of 1944. So they chose Shabbat Breshit, the the Shabbat when the Torah portion starts over, as an opportunity to say Kaddish for her. And I think part of what her story begs of us is to ask the question of like what changes in our understanding of what it means to be a female rabbi today when we learn that there was a woman who became a rabbi in 1935 but was forgotten. Um, we at JW actually made a short film from that trip that asked these pioneering rabbis that question and asked them to reflect on that. I think her story points out also the opportunities that times of crisis can provide for people on the margins, right? There were opportunities that she had that were very different from during the Holocaust, that were different than what she had that came before that. Um, Her story, because it asks us to think differently about that timeline of, you know, innovation and pioneering, made me think a lot about how do we think about first and how do we know who's a first and why do we focus on that so much? And one of the stories that is part of JWA through our encyclopedia, when we added the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women into our content, we learned many more stories. And so I want to add to that question the story of another woman, Asnat Barzani, who served as the head of a yeshiva in Kurdistan in the 17th century. And I think, again, I come to her story because rediscovering the story of Regina Jonas reminds us that the ones who we think of as the first or the only often are not. There is often a precursor whose story was lost or hidden. And Asnat Barzani is one of those figures. She was not an ordained rabbi, but the head of a yeshiva is actually a bigger position of authority than an ordained rabbi. She was born around 1560. Um, Actually, I think it's 1590. I have this written wrong in my notes. I think she was born around 1590. Her father, Rabbi Shmuel ben Netanel Halevi, built a yeshiva in Mosul. He, like Henrietta Zoll's father, had no sons, so he trained his daughter to be a scholar as he would have a son. We know about her because she wrote letters which survived. There are also a lot of stories about her in folklore because she was a very unusual figure. Asnat married one of her father's students. The condition of the marriage, according that her father made him agree to, was that she would not have to do housework, so she could continue studying. And while her husband was studying, she would teach many of his students. When her father died, her husband technically became the head of the yeshiva, though she continued to be the primary teacher. But then when her husband died, she became the leader of the yeshiva. Under her leadership, it faced financial concerns, which were made more difficult because as a woman, she was not able to travel to raise money. So she couldn't do some of the things, the sort of social custom did not allow her to do some of the things that a head of yeshiva would normally do. And we have letters describing that situation. Interestingly, the folklore stories about her also give her kind of supernatural powers. Ultimately, her son went to Baghdad and continued the family's rabbinic dynasty. Her stories in our encyclopedia, as I said, which we are always expanding. And in fact, we expand it particularly with a focus on previously underrepresented subjects like Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, Jews of color, LGBTQ Jews, Jews from the Global South. The image that I have here on the slide is from a kid's book that came out a few years ago called Osnat and Her Dove by Sigal Samuel. And her name is sometimes spelled in different ways, sometimes Asnat with an A, sometimes Osnat with an O. I want to wrap up. I'm going to jump abruptly from the 17th century to the present, because ultimately we do this work because we believe in and are invested in the future. And I'm showing you a slide of some of JWA's Rising Voices Fellowship, our teen fellowship, and our alumni network. And really working with young people animates our work in an incredibly deep and inspiring way. We introduce them to their historical legacy. We help them find their place in history as Jewish women. And then we get to see where it inspires them and what lessons they take from it and where they push back and what they're building on. So I was thinking about a piece that a current fellow wrote recently about Charlotte Charlach, and that will be the last image that I show you. Charlotte Charlach was a German-American actress, translator, teacher, singer, dancer, violinist. She was also one of the first transgender women to receive gender affirming surgery at Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexual Silence in Berlin. This was in the 1930s. She also worked at the institute and helped other transgender patients there. I'll just remind people that the Hirschfeld's Institute was raided in 1933 and was in that moment became its papers and books were the stuff of the first Nazi book burning. So it was really where the Nazi book burning started. And I think it is really interesting to think about where these kinds of projects, these genocidal projects start, who are their first victims. Charlotte Charlach and her lover, Tony Ebel, in 1934 escape Berlin to Czechoslovakia. And they do so, in fact, with the help of the Jewish community to some extent. They live in exile from 1934 on. Charlach ultimately escapes to New York City in 1942, where she spent her later years as a really beloved member of the queer and artistic theater scene in New York. Her story is very interesting. She had lived part of her life in the States, so she had she had American citizenship, but obviously as a Jew and as a trans person, her status and her papers were complicated and made moving from place to place very complicated. But I tell her story because one of our teen fellows, Jess, learned through JWA about Charlotte Charlach and found herself deeply moved and inspired by this story. And she wrote about what it meant to see herself in some way reflected in the archive and how to draw lessons from Charlach's resilience to speak to us in this difficult moment right now. And I think I want to end with her story, and we'll have time for questions, but I want to end my presentation with her story because I think one of the things that we see in challenging times is that history can be a source of strength and resilience and imagination. It also encourages complexity and helps us fight polarization. It breaks us sometimes out of paralysis when we're stuck scrolling the news, but don't know how to think about it differently. So just in conclusion, how do these stories help change our understanding of history? First of all, we see that women as shapers of culture, women like Rosa Sonneschein and Charlotte Charlach, help create new spaces for new Jewish identities to develop and to be explored. We see that women as state builders, like Henrietta Zold, can take on new roles where they have to negotiate, often in complex ways, Jewish identity, national identity, and gender identity. We see that women as activists, like the Housewives of the Kosher Meat Boycott, like the Couriers of the Holocaust, they bring new perspectives from the margins. They model different ways to make change and resist. They push us to think about those categories of activism, of resistance in different ways than we might if we were looking at other stories. We see models of leadership and authority, both ones from the past that we haven't learned about necessarily, like Asnat Barzani and Regina Jonas, and as we're creating them today. And we think about what are those connections between the two. And ultimately, when these kinds of stories are placed at the center, how might we see Judaism and Jewish history and Jewish community differently? And ultimately, how might we understand our own roles and our own power and our own legacy differently? So I leave you with those questions, as well as many links to explore. These are just a few of the tens of thousands of stories that we have at JWA, a collection that is always growing. And so I look forward to hearing your questions.
Well, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. I have to say most of those stories were unknown to me before today. So definitely was a treat for me. We have a bunch of questions that people have submitted. But I also want to remind everyone, if you haven't submitted a question yet and would like to, please feel free. And since we have, quite a few, if some are similar, I tend to combine them. And apologies in advance if I don't get to everyone's question. I'll start. A few people were asking about something kind of early on in your presentation, about digitizing Jewess magazine. People were asking if you could talk just a little bit more about the process of digitizing that magazine and if you have any other digitization projects in the work or if you might in the future.
That's an excellent question. We did that project quite a while ago, and I will
Mhm.
say that I was not the main person doing that project, so my knowledge of it is not, in the weeds, but I can tell
Right.
you that um, there was all of the there were various libraries that had part
Mhm.
of the run of the American Jewish. So different libraries would have like one or two issues, but nobody had the whole thing. We partnered with the University of Michigan to do that digitization project. And
Mhm.
through that, I think there was one that took us a very long time to hunt down, and we ultimately found on eBay, one issue. But otherwise, in partnership with other libraries, and that's often how we do our work because we do not have a physical collection. Our collection as a digital collection, much of it is sort of gathered in partnership with other existing physical libraries and archives. So by working with partner institutions, we were able to bring together the full run of the American Jewess and working with the University of Michigan to make it available, to digitize and make available. We haven't done any other large scale digitization projects like that. It's not really um, sort of our specialty because we're not a library and more, we did that project, I don't know, probably close to 20 years ago when libraries were just beginning to do that work and we were kind of pushing that. Now, many libraries have taken that on. They understand that that's part of their work. In fact, most of them, much to my sadness, are not even collecting physical books anymore or physical periodicals, right? So libraries are doing more of that work and therefore we haven't needed to step into the breach quite as much.
Well, thank you for that explanation. And yeah, glad to hear that libraries are, doing this kind of work as well. Um, Going on kind of a related question, some people are asking, in particular about these stories and the women that you highlighted today in your presentation, how JWA has kind of compiled all of these stories, the process for that, and also, some of the archival photos and things that you have as well.
Yeah, so it's really a work in progress. And again, we
Mhm.
do it with so many different kinds of partners. So, for example, our Encyclopedia of Jewish Women is a work that we now house and publish. It was
Mhm.
originally, it built off of an original version that was only American women and was
Mhm.
published in paper and hard copy, and then morphed into a new project that came out on CD-ROM in 2000
Mhm.
five or six, which was sort of at the end of the CD-ROM era,
Mhm.
and ultimately was brought onto our site where we've made it accessible to millions of people a year. And we published a new edition in 2021 and are continually adding and growing that. We do that in partnership with a large editorial board of
Mhm.
scholars around the world who help us figure out who we need to include and then help us
Mhm.
find scholars to write those pieces. And then, of course, we're in partnership with hundreds of scholars who actually write and experts who write the essays for that. Um, so that's one kind of project that
Mhm.
involves, really partnerships with scholars. Other content on our site is stuff that we've done more in-house. Sometimes,
Mhm.
we have oral histories that we've done in partnership with people that we've trained to collect oral histories or have hired to collect oral histories. We have online exhibits that we've worked on that we have curated and that have helped collect material that then gets included in the exhibits and that becomes part of our collection. We're
Mhm.
always trying to source new photos
Mhm.
and other documents, sometimes in partnership with archives who will
Mhm.
write about a piece for us and then we'll have a digital copy of it that goes
Mhm.
along with it. Sometimes we will just approach, photographers or other places and say, can we bring these into our archive? And we work out different kinds of arrangements. We have excellent search engine optimization. So if you search for
Mhm.
anything about Jewish women, we come up pretty high in your Google search. So we have the ability to to bring things to wide access. But we need all of these partnerships with different kinds of experts and scholars and creators to
Mhm.
gather the full range of materials.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great explanation, and I love, hearing about how that, research and process goes. Um, we have a couple other questions that are asking just basically about JWA itself. Um, some people are wondering, since you all have been around for quite a while now, and the times we live in are constantly changing and evolving. Some people are asking how or if the mission of JWA has changed or evolved over the years, and if you see it kind of continuing to evolve as, time goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the core element of our mission, I would say, is unchanged, but what that
Mhm.
actually means and what it looks like is always growing. And I think that's true. It's true of feminism in general as well, right? Like feminism begins with looking at, you know, gender and power and focusing on women, and then
Mhm.
those insights and that uh kind of, I don't know, categories of analysis get applied more broadly and are used for liberation of other people as well, not just women, right? So, and I think
Mhm.
that that's been true for JWA as well. So we began really with a focus on women's stories, and women remain at the center for
Mhm.
sure, but it
Mhm.
it kind of doing this work sensitizes one to always thinking about what are the stories that we're not hearing, what are the stories that are on the margins, and how do we bring
Mhm.
those in. So for example, like as I said, we now have a very clear commitment that at least 30% of the material, the content that we create each year needs to focus on previously underrepresented categories. Um, that grew out of that commitment to our core commitment to expanding and transforming the Jewish narrative and thinking about what are the stories that we're still not hearing. Um,
Mhm.
our newest fellowship, which is Amplifying Jewish Women of Color, grew out of that commitment of thinking what are the stories that are on the margins and that need to be brought more to the center. Who are the voices that we're not hearing? I think another way that our work has changed is that our understanding of gender has changed in the last 30
Mhm.
years, right? So I don't think anybody was in the early years of the archive, there were a lot of questions about who counts as a Jew and who do we
Mhm.
include as a Jew in the archive, but there wasn't a lot of question about who counts as a woman,
Mhm.
right? Um, and now a lot of our work is thinking about gender and what gender is and how do
Mhm.
we think about gender in non-binary ways and what does it mean to look at history with attention to gender expansiveness and to notice where that appears in the archive and to think about how can we be inclusive around gender in the archive. So those are questions that, are newer questions. And
Mhm.
it keeps the work quite exciting and makes it assures that we don't get rigid and stodgy in our categories, which I think is really important.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree that's very important. Kind of as you have been talking, some people have been writing in with kind of follow-up questions. Some people are wondering, since your mission has changed and evolved a little bit to kind of include, previously underrepresented stories. When JWA is kind of looking to create this content, do people ever approach you saying this is an underrepresented story I'd like to see? Or is it more often you all are reaching out to your networks and partners and saying, these are the stories that we're looking to kind of unearth or highlight more in the future?
Definitely both. I mean,
Mhm.
we get a lot of feedback from people and a lot of recommendations of stories and topics that we should be covering for our encyclopedia. There is a way on our website to kind of
Mhm.
nominate somebody or to suggest somebody for inclusion in the encyclopedia. I will warn you, we have a very long list of more than 500 that
Great.
are already on the list, and we're constantly working with our uh, editorial board to kind of figure out how to prioritize and you know,
Mhm.
how we're going to do that. So I encourage people to submit suggestions and also beg your patience that it will take a long time for pieces to be added. But it's really, really important for us to be hearing from people. And we hear it from, you know, part of what I love about the JWA community is it is a global community. It is a
Mhm.
multi-generational community. And so because of that, we get all different kinds of
Mhm.
suggestions, right? You know, the teens in our fellowship program have different interests and concerns than, you know, the people who are living in Eastern Europe who are interested in, you know, seeing other kinds of stories maybe. And, you know, so there's just all different kinds of stuff that comes to us. Certainly, you know, part of what we're able to build on is when new academic work is being done, we are
Mhm.
able, part of our job is to make sure that that work doesn't kind of linger in the
Mhm.
ivory tower, but that it makes it out into communal conversation. And that's part of what we do as a public history organization. But we also, you know, meet people on social
Mhm.
media who are doing really interesting work. And we say, hey, this should be part of the archive. We have a series on our blog called 7 Questions, which is basically an interview series where we interview mostly young people, young Jews doing interesting
Mhm.
work that you probably haven't heard about. And it's just a way for us to kind of bring some of those voices into the conversation and attract a little attention. It's not history yet, but it's how history, you know, gets compiled.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that and definitely encourage anyone watching to, submit their suggestions of who they think should be included. I know we're nearing the end of the hour, so I think we have room for, maybe one more question. Um, some people are asking, specifically about the stories you highlighted in your incredible presentation. Given the expansiveness of what JWA does, a couple people have asked how, in preparation for tonight, you sort of went about selecting the stories you wanted to highlight, and if there was, kind of a through line between them, or it was just some stories that you thought were really important and wanted to share.
I was trying to just give a both a variety of different kinds of
Mhm.
stories, and people from different places and time periods, and also highlight material that came from different parts of our collection, right? So some
Mhm.
pieces that you would find in the encyclopedia and some that, you know, are in our This Week in History collection. And
Mhm.
you know, there's one piece among the links that I shared that's from our curriculum, and the American Jewess is one kind of, you know,
Mhm.
category. So, and pieces from our Women Rabbis collection to try to give people a little bit of a sense of the breadth. I realize that might not be an obvious uh, diversity if you don't know our site, but I was kind of trying to pick from different places. That being said, it's really
Mhm.
hard. I mean, I could give this presentation 50 different ways, or probably 150 different ways, or maybe 1,000 different ways. But some of it is just stories that like personally appeal to me, or that I've
Mhm.
done more in-depth research on. And so I can talk about kind of with a little bit more, you know, texture.
Mhm.
And some are things that, you know, the piece that our Rising Voices fellow Jess wrote, I read recently and was
Mhm.
thinking about. And so it just kind of caught my mind. And I was trying to think of, you know, bring in things that are, that speak to the moment as well.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great question to end on. And certainly the presentation left me, wanting more. And I will definitely be exploring the site for more interesting stories. But I wanted to thank everyone so much for joining us.